Good morning. Over the last 12 months, we've become accustomed to seeing rainbows in people's houses, in shop windows, and even by the roadside. They have become an almost ubiquitous sign of gratitude for the NHS. You can even buy a rainbow NHS badge. I think it's good that we show our gratitude, even if I sometimes worry that we thank some people and not others. But what I want to think about today is the symbolism of the rainbow, and more generally, how symbols are an important part of our faith. Indeed, I want to suggest that symbols are both part of our faith and the way that we are able to express it. The cross being the most significant example of this. But let's think about rainbows a bit more first. The NHS, or was it the politicians or the media, are not the first people to use the rainbow symbolically. Take a moment to think about where you have seen a rainbow used, and indeed what it means for you. As well as the NHS, I can think of the rainbow being used in lots of different ways. Going back to my teenage days, I remember the Greenpeace boat, the Rainbow Warrior, symbolising the value of ecology and the environment. Nelson Mandela described the people of South Africa as a rainbow nation to reflect diversity. Facebook is awash with posts and memes that use the rainbow as a symbol of hope. Storms don't last forever, says one post with a rainbow background. More recently, the LGBT movement has used the rainbow as a sign of inclusivity, and churches and other groups have then used this symbol as a sign of inclusive welcome. And then back in the 1960s, so I'm told, the rainbow was used as a sign of peace. Looking at these rainbows, it stands for hope, for diversity, gratitude, peace, inclusion, and welcome. Perhaps we should be concerned about the appropriation of the rainbow symbol. It is, after all, the Christian symbol of hope and faith, is it not? But actually, I don't think we need to be worried. The use of the rainbow by others that has a specific meaning for us gives us an opportunity to share our understanding, our faith, our traditions, and hear what is important to others. Furthermore, anthropologists tell us that the cultures throughout history, and long before Noah and his ark, have used the rainbow. Aboriginals, for example, have used a rainbow snake for about 10,000 years as part of their understanding of the dream world. But in traditional Christian thought, the rainbow is the sign of the covenant God makes with us, that the earth will never again be destroyed by a flood. We often think of the rainbow as a reminder to us of this, but actually it's described in Genesis as a reminder to God. I think I'll leave the tricky question of why God needs a reminder to another day. Scientists tell us that actually there have been many floods. Indeed, every major culture has one or more flood story as part of their folklore or tradition. So for me, whilst I'm sure there have been floods, I see this story not about one specific flood, but as an attempt to understand why devastation happened, and indeed still does. Before the flood in the story, natural disaster may have been attributed to God. But after the rainbow and the promise that it symbolises, we understand that this is not how God works. The rainbow then becomes not only a symbol of hope and faith, but also a symbol of that new understanding. Symbols in our faith, I suggest, have multiple purposes. They help us to remember an event. They can act as a parable. They can give meaning to something that is otherwise difficult to understand. And they can act as markers in our lives. And I want to digress momentarily to consider markers specifically. A friend told me that they're going to a family funeral next week, and as they are a minister, they'll be conducting it too. We talked about the challenges of funerals during this COVID time. I've had similar conversations with a friend who's a funeral director. The ritual and symbolism of funerals and memorial services has been in part taken away from us during COVID. I want to suggest that perhaps as churches and as circuits, we need to consider how we can offer this symbolism in new ways when the COVID restrictions are finally over. How we can find new ways, new symbols, so that we and others can mark life and death before God. To mark not only what we have lost and what we have endured during COVID, but also what we have learned about ourselves, about compassion, about self-sacrifice, and about our relationship to God. Our reading from Mark's Gospel contains, I suggest, the symbolisms for all the reasons I outlined earlier. It's a rather odd reading. In 3 short paragraphs, it moves us from Nazareth to the River Jordan, to the wilderness, and then into Galilee. At the same time, Jesus goes from a man growing up in a backwater town to seeking renewal with others, from John the Baptist to the proclaimer of the good news. No longer is the hope for the future, but the time is now. We are given symbols of baptism, of a dove, of a beloved son, wilderness, temptation, wild beasts, and angels. But Mark gives us very little detail, and it's unclear if this is because he only knows the headlines or because he assumes we know the value of the symbols that he refers to. Coming out of the water, it is Jesus rather than the crowd who sees the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove. Again, perhaps it's only Jesus who hears the words that he is the beloved. Baptism acts as a symbol of death and resurrection, and here encapsulates a new beginning and the path to come. As we start Lent this week, it's also appropriate to see the symbolism here through Lenten eyes. Baptism leads to the wilderness retreat, which culminates in the proclamation of the good news. And we can ask ourselves where our journey through Lent this year will lead us. Lent is, of course, full of symbols itself. The beginning of the fast with pancakes, ash crosses, the self-denial of giving things up, and the more recent idea of the symbolism of taking things up instead. The Methodist Church has produced a new guide called Finding the Way, which I understand you should have received a copy of. It's not a Lent guide as such, but certainly could be read through Lent. It seeks to describe the Methodist way of life, but in a modern way. For many, Lent is a time when we make time to reflect, to reassess things, to adjust priorities, to see things from one point of view, to see things not from one point of view, but from viewing points. Perhaps similarly to our story about the flood, there's a change here. Perhaps like the people before and after the flood, we will understand our relationship with the divine in new ways. And if we do, perhaps next time we see that rainbow, we can remember, give thanks, and welcome our new understanding of God into our lives. Amen.